That's after terms of reference approval. Every other week on Wednesdays at the same time, we will discuss a new topic, and we want to encourage you to provide as much input as possible by calling or texting us with your questions or comments. And just to remind you, our number is 1-844-424-0500. That's 1-844-424-0500. So we are doing these radio shows and streaming sessions to help community members and the general public better understand what's involved in the federal impact assessment and provincial environmental assessment processes, and encourage viewers and listeners to participate in these two activities. With me today, live and in studio, is Marian T. McMahon, who's the Deputy Project Manager for ICE on the Webequie Supply Road Project. Good afternoon, Marian, and welcome back
for another Thank you.
Supply Road chat in person, in studio here.
I love this.
Yeah, from our expansive facilities here in Thunder Bay, Ontario. So let's talk about today's session. Today's session has a long name, Marian. It's called the Provincial Environmental Assessment and Federal Impact Assessment Processes. We're going to talk about these two regulatory processes and hopefully make these processes clearer for our listeners and viewers. So maybe let's get started now with you doing a quick run through of what we're going to cover today.
Sure. So tech team, that is slide 2, please. So we'll just give you a brief rundown as to where we are in the project right now. And then we will go through the EA and the IA processes and give you a description there. And then we will also talk about the coordination and the comparison of the two processes. And then following that, we will go into the technical study plans and then the assessment approach. And then we will give you an update, or actually 2 dates for our live streaming events in 2 weeks' time. So lots to cover for today.
Lots to cover in so little time, Marian. Yes. Okay, so before we go any further, let's talk about where we are in the overall planning process. Back on October 8th of last year, 2021, we reached a project milestone, and that was the approval of the terms of reference, so that approval was granted by the Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Planning. And that basically said that we approve your work plan for the environmental assessment, and you can now proceed officially into the environmental assessment phase. So that was a big moment, and so now we are in what we call the EA phase of the work. And maybe Marian, we should talk about the federal and provincial processes, EA and IA processes. IA is federal, EA is provincial. I can kick things off by just talking about, there's actually 3 processes, Marian, right?
Yes, 3.
Webequie has their own process that as a community they're following. And so they are looking at this project and talking about this project in the community, and they will decide at when, at the end of this process, whether they want to proceed with the project. And but there's also federal impact assessment and provincial environmental assessment processes going on, and maybe you could talk a little bit about those.
Sure. So for the federal impact assessment process, before the project can begin, or the assessment can begin, Webequie First Nation, the proponent, develops a project description. And that is an initial project description giving a high-level description as to what the Webequie Supply Road is, the objectives, and all of that. Then that gets submitted to the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada for review. And then what happens is a detailed project description, which builds on the initial project description, gets prepared and submitted to the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada. And then from there, the agency determines whether or not the project requires a federal impact assessment. And so the agency will review that detailed project description, and then they come up with a tailored impact statement guidelines, which is basically the work plan for the impact assessments that the Webclay First Nation should follow when they do the assessment. And then for the provincial environmental assessment, it starts off with a voluntary agreement, which then, once that agreement is in place, Webclay First Nation prepares a terms of reference, which is, again, the work plan for the environmental assessment. So there's a difference there. With the provincial environmental assessment, Webclay First Nation is the one that prepares the work plan. But then for the federal impact assessments, it's the agency that prepares that work plan called the Tailored Impact Statement Guidelines, and we'll go through that later on.
So then we move on to sort of the next phase, which is the core sort of phase where a lot of the work gets done, where the studies are undertaken, and then the preparation of the environmental assessment report or the impact in the federal equipment, the impact statement, are prepared following the work plan set out by the province for the terms of reference and by the federal impact assessment agency through the tailored impact statement guidelines. So that goes on, and then a single coordinated document, which Marian's going to talk about in a minute, is prepared and then they get sent to their respective review agencies and are reviewed. And as you mentioned, slightly different in the federal process. The impact statement then is submitted in the federal process. An impact assessment document is prepared by the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada. And on the provincial side, it's the proponent that prepares the environmental assessment report, and then that's reviewed by the ministry. So that's sort of the process in a nutshell. You and I could sit here and talk about it for 3 hours if we wanted to, but we know we don't have 3 hours today.
No.
So maybe before we go to the next slide, Marian, I'll remind our viewers that the call-in and text number is 1-844-424-0500. That's 1-844-424-0500. Please send us your comments or questions based on what you're hearing today, and we'll be happy to respond to them either now during the show or later on. So, Marian, as we move along, maybe you can tell our viewers and listeners about the coordination that goes on between the federal process and the provincial process.
Sure. So this project is taking a coordinated approach, combining both the federal and the provincial assessment processes. So this does not mean that we are preparing two separate documents to satisfy those requirements. We will be preparing one report or one body of documentation to address what is in the terms of reference and to address what is in the tailored impact statement guidelines. And that final report, at the end of the day, it's going to be an environmental assessment report and impact statement.
Okay, so let's move now. Tech team, if you can switch to slide 6. Or sorry, slide 6, the comparison, yeah. So what we're going to do now is do a very quick high-level comparison between the two processes under two sort of different categories. So let's talk about the work plan for the EA or IA. In the EA process, the provincial process, the proponent prepares the terms of reference or the work plan for the environmental assessment and submits it to the province for review and comment, and to the public as well too. However, in the federal process, the proponent prepares, as you mentioned, Marian, this sort of higher level description of the project called an initial project description. And then that is submitted, and there's comments made, and there's feedback. And then from there, what you call a detailed project description, or DPD, is prepared, and that is submitted. And then, as you mentioned, the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada issues what's essentially the equivalent of the terms of reference for on the provincial side, and it's called the Tailored Impact Statement Guidelines, or TISG or TISG, which is the work plan for the impact assessment. So that's comparing them on sort of one aspect, the work plan. Let's now compare them on the assessment side. So under the EA process, the provincial process, the proponent prepares the EA report, that includes their assessment of impacts for review by MECP. But on the federal side, the IA process, the proponent prepares the impact statement, IAC reviews the impact statement and prepares an impact assessment report. So they do sort of the impact assessment, essentially. So, there are differences, right? And we could, there's more differences as well too, and we could get into those as well, but we're not going to dive into that much detail because we just don't have enough time. So maybe now let's talk a little bit about an activity that we are required to do as part of the federal process, and that's the preparation of technical study plans. And Marian's going to take you through what's in these study plans. These study plans are part of the actual impact assessment part of the process.
Yes.
And I'll let you take that from here now, Marian.
Sure. So tech team, that is slide 7. So we have a number of study plans, which basically sets out a lot of things. So first, it sets out the approach and the methods for collecting baseline information, and this is the information to characterize the environment, to see what the environment is like right now. So we need to understand those baseline conditions and how are we going to collect that information. The study plan also goes into approach and methods for assessing those potential effects. So that goes into, what are our assessment boundaries for these various studies? What are the proposed indicators to measure the potential change based on those effects? Identifying, potential effects and mitigation measures, and then assessing cumulative effects. The study plan also goes into consideration of input. So that means, input from Indigenous communities, from the public, from stakeholders throughout this process, and how that input is taken and included in the study plan. And that's why it's important for you to engage with us, the team, because we want to take that feedback, that input, and include that in the process along the way. We also include a consideration of principles in our study plans. So that's, sustainability principles and even how subpopulation groups may be impacted by all of this. And then, of course, alignment with guidance. We have to ensure that these studies are aligned with what is set out in the Tailored Impact Statement Guidelines as well as the terms of reference.
Thank you, Marian. Let's now move, tech team, if we can move to slide number 8. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the wide variety of technical study plans that were prepared as part of the Webequie Supply Road impact assessment. So, quite often in communities, we've gotten feedback which sort of indicated that, that the environmental assessment or impact assessment process was very sort of limited and only focused on maybe a few selected things. Things have totally changed now. These are big studies covering a lot of different aspects of the environment. So just to give you an idea, I thought I'd run through the different technical study plans that are involved, that we're undertaking as part of this impact assessment. So some of the topics: geology, terrain, and soils, surface and groundwater, air quality and climate change, noise and acoustic, vegetation, wildlife, fish and fish habitat, species at risk, socioeconomics, human health, visual environment, and cumulative effects. So looking at the effect of not only the project, but when looking at other projects in the area that are reasonably foreseeable. So there's a lot that is being studied, isn't there, Mary, as part of an impact assessment. And so, that's something that I think we really need to get across, is that these studies, they take a long time to do. They're done over multiple seasons, multiple years in some cases. That's why an impact assessment takes a while, right? Because
That's
it's a
right.
process of collecting a lot of information. Once you agree on what needs to be done, the work still has to be executed to conduct those studies, and then take the information from the studies and integrate it, and then start looking at impact. So there's a lot involved in it. So Marion, we're at the point now where we're ready to talk about the overall environmental or impact assessment approach. Maybe you can sort of kick things off by talking a bit about a really key component of an environmental assessment or impact assessment, and that's valued components.
Yes. Value components will be considered and assessed throughout the impact assessment or environmental assessment. And what value components are, they're essentially, environmental, health, social, economic, or additional elements or conditions of the natural and human environment that may be affected by the project and are of concern and value to Indigenous communities, to the public, to federal and provincial authorities, and interested parties. So we've identified to date a number of valued components for which we've developed technical study plans for, and these were, developed also based on our engagement and consultation with communities. So again, it is important for you to engage with us and let us know if there is a valued component here that we're missing. Please do tell us, because we want to ensure that we are studying everything and doing a thorough job. So I'll just run through these quickly. Our VCs are geology, terrain, and soils, surface water, groundwater, air quality, climate change, noise, vegetation and wetlands, fish and fish habitat, wildlife, including migratory birds, archaeological resources, built heritage and cultural heritage resources, socioeconomic environment, Indigenous land and resource use, Aboriginal and treaty rights and interests, visual environment, and human health.
It's a long list, Marion.
Very long list.
Very long list. Okay, let's now talk about another term you're going to hear a lot when it comes to an environmental assessment or impact assessment, and that term is indicators. So if our tech team can switch to slide number 11, please. I'll talk a bit about indicators. So, okay, what are indicators? They represent the source, feature, or issue related to a valued component that Marion just described, that if changed, may demonstrate an effect on the environment. Okay, what does that really mean? It's a way of measuring something related to the valued component. That's what it boils down to. That's what an indicator is. So for each VC, we have in the terms of reference, or we receive from the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada, indicators, right? What we need to measure. And that's what the studies are about. The studies are basically the execution of the measurement of existing conditions, and then from there, so they follow the indicators that are described in the work plans, in the terms of reference, in the tailored impact statement guidelines, and then apply these indicators, these measuring tools, to come up with a snapshot of current conditions. We're going to talk about those a little bit later on now. So that's what indicators are. So Marion, why don't we talk about another key component of assessment, and that's spatial assessment boundaries. Maybe you can sort of explain for us what these are.
Sure. So spatial boundaries define the geographic extent of potential environmental effects of the project. And these are used to define the study area for collecting baseline information and for the effects assessment itself. And these, and I'll get into it later, but they vary depending on the valued components. It's not the same across all valued components because there's a lot of things there to consider when delineating your study areas. And so these study areas have been established to focus on the two route alternatives for the project. within a proposed preliminary 2-kilometer wide corridor that's identified in the terms of reference and the detailed project description. And so we've come up with spatial assessment boundaries, tech team, that's slide 13. So we've come up with 3 general study areas, which are the project footprint, the local study area, and the regional study area. So what do we mean by project footprint? That means it's the development area. So that's the area of direct disturbance for the project during construction or operation, and that's 35 meters right of way. And then our local study area, which is essentially the area with where the direct and indirect effects of the project are likely to occur, and that has a 1-kilometer buffer within the 2-kilometer wide corridor with a 500-meter range from the supportive infrastructure. And then for the regional study area, that's the area where potential indirect or cumulative effects may occur, and that's just a broader study area there.
Thank you, Marian. So let's sort of take what Marian just talked about and look at these study areas as applied to the 2 alternatives we have for the Webway Supply Road project. So if the tech team can switch to slide 14, we get that map up on the screen. Great, we do. So, okay, so what are we looking at here? So we're looking at, there's 2 alternatives, the Webway Supply Road. The first one is, the first alternative was the one developed by the community, identifying where they would prefer the center line of the road to go. The second one was derived from that, and it was sort of a technical evaluation of that. So it's not significantly different, but it's more sort of technically preferred because it goes through better areas with better terrain, easier to build on, and factors like that. So what you're seeing on your screen now on this map is the local and regional, well, the project footprint, the local and regional study areas on your screen here. So that just gives you an idea of what that sort of looks like beyond words. So maybe now, Marian, why don't we talk a little bit about valued components again? And a key point to note is that valued component study areas, and I think you touched on this a bit before, are not always the same.
Correct.
Maybe you can explain sort of why they're not always the same.
Sure. So for each valued component, they have their own study areas, and this ranges from different valued components. So for instance, when studying caribou, we have to take into consideration the caribou ranges that's there. Similarly, when we are studying water, we have to consider the watersheds. So the study areas will differ based on information such as that. But we also include, input from Indigenous communities and groups, including what we hear from you today. So definitely get your comments and feedback in. We also consider Indigenous knowledge, if communities are willing to share that Indigenous knowledge, so we know the areas to avoid and to include and study within our study area. We also consider the current or traditional land and resource use by Indigenous communities, as well as the exercise of Aboriginal and treaty rights of Indigenous peoples, including cultural and spiritual practices. So there's a lot of considerations there. We also look at physical, ecological, technical, social, health, and economic and cultural considerations when we are developing our study areas.
Thank you, Marian. Let's now move on to talk about something called temporal assessment boundaries. So this is for our tech team. It's slide number 16. So what are temporal assessment boundaries, you may be asking? Well, they're the timelines that for consideration of baseline information and potential effects of the project. So what you do is you look at the project, you break it into 2 phases. Something like this would be the construction phase, and there would be the operations phase. So for a project of this nature, construction phase is anywhere between probably 3 and 6 years. Construction includes all activities associated with the development of the road and supportive infrastructure, so things like access roads to gravel pits and quarries and things like that, lay down areas, that's part of the construction phase, right up until the road is complete, and then you move into what's called the operations phase. And in this case, it's estimated to be, let's say, 75 years, where all activities associated with operating the road and maintaining the road are undertaken. So that's what temporal means. It talks about time. It's time, the length of time within which the impacts are considered. So that's temporal assessment boundaries. And now let's move to probably one of the most core set of activities involved in an environmental or impact assessment, Marian, and that's baseline studies. Maybe you can give us a quick overview of those.
Sure, absolutely. So baseline studies, they establish our existing conditions of the environment. So we have to characterize what does the environment look like now. So that goes with the natural environment as well as the human environment, looking at the conditions of communities within our study area. So why are baseline studies important? So they serve as a reference point to allow for comparison when assessing potential effects. It can also help to inform on mitigation measures to avoid or reduce effects during construction and operation. And it just provides that snapshot of the current conditions for future environmental monitoring and success of mitigation measures to avoid or reduce those effects. So these baseline studies have been conducted through 2019 and 2021, and some studies are continuing on this year as well, just to help us better understand the current conditions right now of the environment.
Thank you, Marian. Let's move tech team to slide number 18. And I'm going to very quickly give you sort of a rundown of the types of studies that are done as part of baseline studies. They're organized under three main categories. The first is natural, and this is probably more familiar to our viewers, and that would include, these are biophysical studies, natural or biophysical studies. So they could include vegetation, wildlife, fish and fish habitat, species at risk, air quality, climate change, noise and vibration. This one maybe not always considered, by the general public, but it's certainly something that's studied. Visual environment, surface water, groundwater, geology, terrain, and soils. Then there's a whole other category of baseline studies, socioeconomic studies. So these would be profiles of indigenous communities. When we say profiles, it could be the makeup of the community in terms of the population, the demographics, age, sex, etc., education and employment, household composition, infrastructure, social services, and then human health and land and resource use, and then another key one, Marian, indigenous knowledge and land and resource use, which was very closely related to the third category,
Yes.
which is cultural. So archaeological resources, built heritage, cultural heritage landscapes. So there are a lot of studies associated with an environmental assessment or an impact assessment, a lot of studies, and we could talk in detail for a long time. We've done single shows on one study, for that matter, just covering at a high level what's included. So there's a lot involved in an environmental assessment and an impact assessment. And one thing for our Indigenous community members out there, we are encouraging you to provide us with Indigenous knowledge, because we want to be able to incorporate Indigenous knowledge in all aspects of the environmental assessment, the impact assessment. It's very important that we do that, because we want to hear from community members, and we want it's Western science combined with Indigenous knowledge, and that's how we can get the most comprehensive kind of impact assessment or environmental assessment that we can put together. So we're almost out of time now, Marian, and I think you touched on this a bit before. We got the next couple shows coming up are both dedicated to, actually the next three shows.
Yes, next three shows.
It's a three-part series on Indigenous knowledge coming up. And the first part is, what is Indigenous knowledge? That's in 2 weeks on February 23rd.
That's right.
And then on March 9th, we have Indigenous knowledge part 2, integrating Indigenous knowledge into the environmental assessment or impact assessment. So we got a lot coming up on Indigenous knowledge, and we hope it encourages you to share your community's Indigenous knowledge with us so we can make our project better and more comprehensive and more robust. And well, I guess that wraps up today's discussion, doesn't it, Marian?
Flew
Blew
by.
didn't it? So we'll be back, as I said, again in 2 weeks when we start that 3-part series on Indigenous knowledge. Don't forget to visit our website at supplyroad.ca. There's tons of information there, and you can contact us through there and in other ways. We're also on social media at WFN Supply Road. So lots of ways to get in touch with us. And we look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks when we talk about Indigenous knowledge. Miigwech, and again, see you in 2 weeks.